Today's video is sponsored by Call of Dragons. Call of Dragons is a strategy game of both MMO fantasy and conquest. In it, you will explore the realm of Tamaris, a land of lush wilderness, icy tundras, and scorched deserts occupied by deadly behemoths for you to capture. Guys, I am a sucker for strategy games, and here, you can actually deploy troops to explore a vast 3.8 million square kilometer map to uncover these deadly behemoth lairs. And then you fight to tame each one of these beasts. You could fight ancient giant bears. You could tame ferocious thunder rocks with your alliance. You could capture and train any of the 8 behemoths to suit your needs before unleashing them upon everything. And with every season, the appearance of a red dragon leads to a bloody and terrifying struggle, with only the strongest of dragon lords able to bring this incredible beast to heel. Now with PC and mobile crossplay, you can join forces with your allies in raids, help your friends out in need, or even check in on your kingdom at any time, anywhere. Download Call of Dragons today using our link in the description below, and be sure to use code CODMONSTER to claim special in-game rewards fit for a Dragon Lord. Guys, it finally happened. After years of being one of the most rocket launchers of all time, Eyes of Tomorrow has finally seen a buff in patch 7.1.0 alongside the launch of Season of the Deep. Now, this weapon has always been a really intriguing one since it launched in Beyond Light. For those who are newer or might not remember, Eyes of Tomorrow is an exotic rocket launcher that drops from the final encounter in the Deepstone Crypt raid. Yes, this is a raid exotic, which means you have to combat RNG, you gotta learn raid mechanics, assemble a team, acquire an RNG crystal, all of these things in hopes of getting what should have been a phenomenal weapon. Unfortunately, Eyes of Tomorrow just wasn't hitting the mark. Now personally, I love this weapon, man. Truly, its tracking capabilities. I remember the first time we reviewed this weapon, we brought it inside of Gambit, and dude, I was having so much fun with it. Now for those that are trying to get this exotic, after you've watched this review, Bungie did increase exotic drop chances within the Deepstone's raid seal. Now before covering this buff, let's cover how Eyes of Tomorrow actually works. Eyes of Tomorrow comes with the exotic trait Eyes on All, stating that this weapon is capable of tracking and firing at multiple targets simultaneously. Now this works exactly how it sounds. Eyes shoots mini rockets and they'll track towards an enemy that you have targeted, and if you ADS on an enemy, you'll see a tracking diamond appear on top of them. Now keep in mind, you can only track up to 5 enemies at once. I found this to be pretty odd since Eyes of Tomorrow shoots 6 rockets. But sometimes that's just how Bungie makes things. Regardless though, once you tracked up to 5 enemies while ADSing and then you shoot the weapon, it'll fire 6 mini rockets that track straight towards your targets. Now the targeting on this thing is pretty aggressive, man. I mean, we've seen some wild clips out there with Eyes of Tomorrow. And you remember way back when it first dropped, the hellfire invaders would rain with this thing was nuts. And I know not everybody's playing Gambit, but dude, it was putting the hurt on us. Now in most PvE content, Eyes of Tomorrow has been pretty mediocre quite some time. Anything that Eyes could do could simply be done by better options in that slot, giving little reason to run in over all the other meta heavy options over the years. And this is where Eyes of Tomorrow's new buff comes into play. We're going to be analyzing Eyes PvE performance in today's deep dives, since this is where its new buff applies to most. Now again, the exotic perk on here is Adaptive Ordnance, where it states that defeating 4 or more combatants in a single volley increases the damage of the next volley. Now when testing this damage here at Carl, against him, Eyes was hitting for 24,059 damage per rocket at base. The damage shoots up to a whopping 36,088 damage per rocket upon defeating 4 targets and proccing Adaptive Ordnance. This is a 50% increase in damage, guys, which is a substantial boost to your damage. Now the new buff from patch 7.1.0 states that killing 4 targets with a missile volley will refund 1 ammo. Now this goes into your reserves, and this essentially solves one of the biggest problems that Eyes of Tomorrow had, which was ammo economy. Before, while you got that substantial damage increase from proccing Adaptive Ordnance, you ate up too much ammo, and it really just didn't warrant the use. Why would you use it to wipe a room out to proc Adaptive Ordnance to essentially run out of ammo a few shots later? And I know we have things like Aeon Gauntlets and Cenotaph and other ways to provide ammo, but even with someone on your team rocking Aeon Gauntlets and Sect of Insight, ammo economy for Eyes of Tomorrow has never been good. Now Now though, after this buff to his ammo economy, it at least gives player a new reason to run this thing and frees up the stress of proccing things like adaptive ordnance without having to worry about draining your ammo too quickly. Now, one thing to take note on, for those that are interested in trying out this weapon, once procced, adaptive ordnance does not go away, even when you switch to other weapons, which is a beautiful thing. If you need to suddenly swap to another weapon, stun a champion, and then swap back, don't worry, adaptive is still there. Now, this adds some newly sound utility to the weapon that had not existed before. Unlike most other rockets, Eyes of Tomorrow's role in the sandbox is not to be a boss damaging weapon. Although it could be, you can use it to get decent burst damage, especially with adaptive ordnance, but it suffers from a pretty strong damage penalty against bosses, similar to something like Warcliffe Coil. Granted, Warcliffe is kind of weird, where it can shred certain bosses. Look at Shadow Throne and that boss, it does a tremendous amount of damage. But Eyes of Tomorrow does suffer from that same issue, and even though it offers some amazing kabloomies, it just has not been the best boss damaging weapon. At the same time though, considering its functionality, you would think it was a good ad clearing weapon, but it really wasn't that either. And therefore in PvE, it never really had a moment to shine. But after this adaptive ordnance buff to refund your ammo after every multi-kill, Eyes of Tomorrow seems to finally be viable. Since you get ammo refunded for each 4 kills per barrage that you get, it's actually really easy here to keep chaining it if you have an ad dense encounter. And the nice part about that is that these rockets practically completely overlook the fact that the enemies in these activities will be a lot tankier, pretty much always one-shotting any enemies impacted within blast radius. And then if you happen to stumble upon a champion or Hive Guardian or just any other general mini boss, you can use that extra 50% damage buff from adaptive ordnance to chunk them down too. One thing that is a little disappointing though is that the same damage penalty that applies to bosses also applies to champions and Hive Guardians. We took Eyes into the base Lightblade Strike in the Throne World, and each rocket was hitting for 73,258 damage on red bar acolytes. And when shooting a Hive Guardian, our damage numbers were going down to 25,824 per rocket. And as you can see on the screen right now, this is the same damage number we were hitting against the boss at the end of the strike. This is approximately 35% of its original base damage, which is quite a large cut in damage. However, adaptive ordnance will still give you that extra 50% damage without any penalties, bringing its damage against something like a Hive Guardian up to 38,725 damage per rocket. Even so, after seeing this, we got curious how legendary rockets were affected in similar ways. And inside of a Grandmaster Nightfall, when shooting a minor enemy, a hothead without explosive light was hitting for 71,445 combined damage. Now when hitting a champion, it goes down to 55,966 damage, or around 78% of its original base damage against minors. The main thing we're trying to point out here, guys, and I know that there's going to be a difference in damage between minors, majors, elites, bosses, etc. But the point is, Eyes of Tomorrow faces a substantial higher penalty than its counterparts, which is strange. Now, after seeing how big of a damage cut Eyes of Tomorrow faces against bosses, champions, and Hive Guardians, we wanted to compare it to other meta rockets. We actually went inside of Callie's encounter in Last Wish. Eyes was hitting minors for 20,115 damage, and Callie for 7,091. And essentially, guys, this just confirmed that the damage reduction for bosses was working properly. Then we started with single rocket damage versus Callie. Now, as a quick note, all legendary rockets we test here do have impact casing and ball spec. We also didn't run any reserve mods for this testing. Now, DPS timings, of course, may vary due to some human error, but they should be more than indicative enough of what to expect in your own games. Eyes of Tomorrow was hitting 7,091 damage per rocket against Callie for a total of 42,546 damage. Now, with adaptive ordnance, this shot up to 10,636 damage per rocket for a total of 63,816 damage. Now, when we compare this to other rockets, this is actually a surprisingly high amount of damage. As for some other exotics, Galahorn was hitting for 29,517 per rocket, Warcliffe was hitting 38,412, and Two-Tailed Fox, with its Catalyst, was hitting for 40,543. Eyes beats all of these. For legendary rockets, a base adaptive frame rocket was hitting for 34,326 damage. Now, Hothead with explosive was hitting around 42,845, which pretty much matches that of base Eyes of Tomorrow. And Apex Predator here with bait and switch was hitting around 46,340 damage. Now, keep in mind, Eyes of Tomorrow, especially Eyes with adaptive, substantially passes up these other rockets. And at first glance, it would sound as if Eyes of Tomorrow was the best rocket launcher in the game, but that's only for 1 rocket. When we start looking at actual DPS, that's when we start to see something very different. Now, we did use Lunafactions here to get our reload speed down, but keep in mind, Eyes of Tomorrow and its reload speed and shot delay is fairly long. Eyes of Tomorrow took somewhere around 23.22 seconds to unload all of its 8 rockets, coming out to a DPS of around 14,658 damage at base, or 15,574 damage with adaptive ordnance on the first rocket. Now, to put it bluntly, practically every other meta rocket launcher in the game beats this big time. Even without the help of something like Explosive Light or Bait and Switch, a base hothead takes around 13.55 seconds to shoot its 7 rockets, getting a DPS value here of 17,732. This alone beats out Eyes of Tomorrow, simply because of how much faster you can reload after shooting. And again, this only gets better when you start tacking on damage perks. With Explosive Light, Hothead has a DPS around 21,505 damage, significantly higher than what you can achieve here with Eyes of Tomorrow. And dude, you can bring in things like Reconstruction, Bait and Switch on Apex Predator, and assuming you shoot the first 2 rockets back to back, it takes somewhere around 12.88 seconds to empty its 7 rockets, giving us a DPS value of around 24,252 damage, which is substantially better than Eyes of Tomorrow. And this is where we start to see the raw DPS power of legendary rockets. And even compared to other exotic rockets, Galahorn, shooting 7 rockets from it takes 11 seconds for a DPS value of 18,783. Warcliffe, shooting 6 rockets, takes 15.32 seconds for a DPS value of 15,043. And Two-Tailed Fox, shooting 8 rockets, takes 20 seconds for a DPS value of 16,036. And that's not even counting the extra jolt and scorch damage from Two-Tailed Fox. And the issue is that even here, with something like Galahorn, which is a support rocket launcher, this weapon is still able to out DPS Eyes of Tomorrow. Now keep in mind, that testing was for sustained DPS. But what about burst DPS? What if you stumbled across a champion or a Hive Guardian in in-game PvE activities and wanted to take it out quickly using your rocket? Actually, right here, guys, we measured how fast it took to shoot 2 rockets for each weapon we tested. Eyes of Tomorrow took around 3.03 seconds to shoot 2 rockets, sporting a DPS of around 28,083, or with adaptive ordnance for that first shot, 35,103. But similar to our sustained DPS test, this is beat out heavily by other rockets. Hothead with Explosive Light does 37,748 damage for its DPS in around 2.27 seconds. But keep in mind, this gap substantially increases when comparing it to rockets that can hold 2 rounds. Galahorn, even though it's a support weapon, has actually really good burst DPS for those 2 rockets at around 44,722, as it can shoot off both of those rockets within 1.32 seconds. And when you factor in legendary rockets that can get 2 in the mag, the damage gap grows immensely. Hothead with Clown Cartridge can dump 2 rockets in 1.18 seconds for a DPS value of 58,179 damage. Apex Predator with Reconstruction and Bait and Switch can dump 2 rockets in 1.18 seconds for a whopping 73,597 damage. And again, this is with Bait and Switch being procced on the second rocket, with the first rocket just being the normal one. Guys, this is incredible amounts of burst damage, and essentially double that of Eyes with adaptive ordnance. Now, this is where we start to run into some problems with running Eyes of Tomorrow. Sure, it can do some decent damage, and it's a beautiful thing to watch it clear rooms of ads with a single barrage of rockets. But even after its buff, it still feels like it's too high maintenance of a weapon to use with too little reward. Now, don't get me wrong, this buff has definitely made it a lot more viable to run in your exotic slot. As long as you can keep adaptive ordnance constantly rolling with those 4 kills, which by the way, there's no cooldown here. You can re-proc adaptive ordnance back to back as long as you're getting those kills. You won't have to worry about losing a rocket every single time you want to get that extra damage. And once you do stumble upon a champion or a Hive Guardian, hitting them with a barrage with adaptive ordnance damage buff being procced can do some decent burst damage. To top everything off, guys, can I just say it's a fun weapon, right? Like, I know we're looking for the meta, but by God, it's fun. It's a unique weapon, unique design, it's tracking, it's kabloomies. I've always liked Eyes of Tomorrow, and there are ways you can boost the damage a little more. You can pair it with things like Path of Burning Steps on Titan, which boosts our damage after getting solar kills. But I will say, in terms of just raw damage, whether it was dealing with champions, Lucent Hive, or just thicker targets, Eyes felt just okay. And there were times that I was kind of more concerned with trying to proc adaptive ordnance, which was distracting at times. It's so reliant on that ammo refund now. Now, despite this being a nice change, it brings about some stress, man. Like the times you don't proc adaptive ordnance, it's like damn, that sucks. You shoot a broad into some enemies and one of them moves behind cover or teleports out of the way, or say gets shielded by something like a servitor, you're out of luck and an entire rocket just got wasted. And if you happen to lose adaptive ordnance when going up against a champion or a mini boss, this thing feels like a pea shooter. The damage is underwhelming. Essentially, it's going to require you to use other tools in your loadout if you want to take down that champion before it comes out of its stun. Granted, I know this applies to other weapons. But in the world where we have things like Leviathan's Breath, rocket launchers like Gallahorn, Hothead, linear fusions, which are still very good, Sleeper, Grand Overture, we have some excellent options out there, guys. And so it's hard for me to say, hey, Eyes of Tomorrow is now the go-to option. Heavy weapons aren't really meant for ad clearing. We use it to chew a high health target down or a champion down. And we have other means, whether that be our special weapon or our primary weapon, to take down those ads. Again, I want to stress here that Eyes of Tomorrow is not a bad weapon. It's a cool weapon. I've got a lot of love for this thing. And after its buff, it's fairly strong and a lot of fun to use if you can proc adaptive ordnance, which makes all the difference here. But when it comes to practicality, there's just so many other options out there. So guys, those are our thoughts on Eyes of Tomorrow. Let me know in the comments below what you think. Well, fellas and ladies, thank you all for coming and watching. And as always,
Slap that like button like your mama told you right.